Okay, hope everybody's doing all right. We are headed into the last chapter here. We have three more views to look at, so we're approaching the end here. So again, like in the last chapter, in this final chapter, we're looking at some alternative approaches to ethics or to philosophical ethics, alternatives to kind of the more mainstream orthodox approaches to moral theory that we looked at up until this point in the semester. Although some of the views that we looked at in this current chapter, chapter 6, as well as chapter 5, do have some resemblances to certain aspects of the more mainstream approaches. They've had significant differences, and we'll see that's the case too here in chapter 6. So if you remember, we started with this way back at the beginning of the semester. Here's the definition of moral philosophy that I gave us, right? The central purpose of moral philosophy is to secure valid principles of conduct and values that can be instrumental in guiding human actions and producing good character. And so we've looked at, again, many theories up until this point of the semester. And in traditional, again, mainstream moral theory, the idea is that we're going to identify these moral principles, a moral standard, a normative standard, defend it through the use of rational argumentation. And then if it's a plausible theory, it should give us valid principles to either guide right action or to guide good character, like in the case of a virtue ethics. A couple of the theories that, especially the first one that we'll look at in this chapter, bear some resemblance to virtue ethics in that way, although it'll have some important differences as well. And so again, when we're thinking about these alternative approaches, think about some of the criticisms that have been leveled against things like deontology or Kantian ethics and utilitarianism, where they had these abstract notions of moral reasoners, right, that were almost inhuman. That's how the textbook put some of the criticisms, is that they weren't realistic accounts of the human subject or the individual persons, that were too abstract and too idealistic in many cases. And what we need is a moral theory that comports to the real world in some ways. Well, one of the ways in which some of the theories we look at in both this last chapter, we're dealing with individual authenticity, and in this chapter, dealing with the emphasis on the other and altruistic attitudes, is they do have a more concrete notion of the individual or the subject, right, or the agent. So keep an eye out for that. As well. Although the last two theories in this section, in this chapter, are more more radical and depart further from mainstream moral theory than the first view that we'll look at in this chapter, care ethics, or the ethics of care, however you want to say that. So let's take a look at care ethics today. So again, we got three approaches that we'll look at in this chapter. The first two, care ethics and the ethics of the other, Levinas's ethics of the other, or ethics of alterity, sometimes it's referred to as ethics of transcendence. Those two approaches to moral thinking, moral philosophy, are what I would call other-oriented. They prioritize the other, or other individuals, right, over an egoistic self. So think of the theories that we looked at in the last chapter. Whether it was Nietzsche, whether it was Sartre, or whether it was Simone de Beauvoir, the emphasis was on self-creation and individual authenticity. What do we do with my own freedom, right? And how do I, what am I, I'm either engaging in bad faith or accepting my radical freedom and my responsibility for what I value and what I choose to value. There, the emphasis is on, kind of gives priority to shaping one's own self. Well, care ethics and the ethics of the other, those are going to emphasize more an altruistic point of departure for ethics. So instead of ethics being primarily about shaping my own existence, my own life, my own sense of identity, it's going to be, in these thinkers, it's going to be, it's going to involve an emphasis on other regarding attitudes. All right, or in the case of Levinas, the experience of the other is the basis for obligation. Now, Foucault is a little bit different. in some, that's why I put an asterisk by his name here, because the ethics of resistance, it bears more in common with the, to my thinking, to the theories that we looked at in the last chapter from Nietzsche and Sartre. Foucault is a neo-Nietzschean philosopher. He was deeply influenced by Nietzsche, and was in part a reaction to and critique of the existentialist philosophers like Sartre. But nevertheless, his approach to ethics emphasizes self-creation and self-transformation in a way that's more similar to those theories than to the ethics of care or the ethics of the other. So, you know, it's a little bit, on the face of it, it may be a little bit odd to throw Foucault there in the end, because his way of thinking about the relationship between self and other is a little bit different than either care ethics or the ethics of the other, and bears more in common to the last chapter than those two views in this chapter. So that's why I put a little asterisk by his name there. And so we're going to start off again with the ethics of care. This is an approach to moral philosophy that is kind of developed in more Western Anglophone world of philosophy, as opposed to continental or European philosophy in the 20th century. And it has its bearings in some moral psychology, actually. So in this regard, it is a little bit more similar to some of the theories that we've looked at previously. So the ethics of care, or care ethics, I call an alternative approach to philosophical ethics that emphasizes particular relationships or concrete relationships and sympathy and empathy, those attitudes, those dispositions, over abstract principles of justice, obligation, or impartial moral reasoning, and the sorts of things we more readily associate with utilitarianism and deontology or Kantian ethics. Whereas those construed social relationships between the self and the other rather abstractly. I'm either a utility pump and I relate to you as another utility pump, and we're just involved in these relationships that where either the benefactor or the victim of the consequences of each other's actions, or these abstract moral reasoners in Kant. The care ethics emphasizes particular human relationships. So that's a bit of a departure from modern moral theory, certainly. And it's also going to emphasize, again, sympathy and empathy. So other regarding attitudes as the primary basis of ethics. So many of us, just in our ordinary lives, think of ethics primarily as about what we owe others, right? And not being selfish and this sort of thing. And so that fits kind of with some aspects of our just everyday moral reasoning, right? And again, it emphasizes these particular relationships and those attitudes over abstract principles of justice, like the categorical imperative or the greatest happiness principle. So we've got two key issues involved with this approach to ethics here. I got to crack my neck a little bit here. Been sitting in a chair too long. So we got two key issues here. The first is, like Simone de Beauvoir in her existential feminism, the ethics of care has been developed by feminist thinkers, right? And so one of the key things here is the question of whether traditional moral theory like utilitarianism and deontology, maybe even Aristotle's virtue ethics, has that excluded the female moral perspective? Does traditional moral theory have a male bias? You've probably noticed that almost every thinker that we've studied up until this point in the semester has been a man, right? And a man almost always of a certain class and race, right? A certain socioeconomic status, and a Western man, right? As opposed to some Eastern schools of thought. And then we have the second issue here, although it's related to the first one. Do men and women have different moral perspectives, like an emphasis on justice versus care, sympathy and empathy? Right? So we'll worry about those two issues here. In fact, one of the central debates with regard to care ethics is the justice versus care debate. And so we'll look at a little bit at that as well here. So just take a second here and think to yourself, what kinds of traits are typically, right, associated with men versus women in our industrial Western societies, or traditional society for that matter. And invariably, people come up with a very common set of traits here. So men are often characterized as assertive, as rational, as calculating, and as autonomous, right, independent. right? And on the other hand, women are often characterized in terms of traits like passivity, emotional as opposed to rational, altruistic, right? And dependence rather than independence, right? And so these are some, I want to say, stereotypical traits that are often associated with men versus women, or the feminine versus the masculine. Right? And so, again, the care ethics has its roots in some moral psychology. And so Carol Gilligan was one of the first, kind of one of the pioneers or proponents of this approach to ethics. And she was a psychologist primarily rather than a philosopher. And so she bases her work on some psychological studies that she had done. She took issue with another theory of moral development from psychology developed by Lawrence Kohlberg's theory. Kohlberg's theory was based on samples and observations of men, right? And so she notes, well, look, that's not really good social science. We need a cross section. Maybe the data that we've gotten from just observing men and their moral development has tainted the theory in some way. So there again, you get a worry about, whether traditional moral theory or theories of moral development out of psychology have male bias to them in some way or another, either explicitly or implicitly, right? And so here's Kohlberg's theory of moral development. It had 6 stages to it. And when we go through and just looking at this list, think about the different theories that we've looked at so far and see where they would fall on this theory, theory of moral development in terms of psychological development, right? So first, the lowest level is when you're a little kid, you just want to avoid punishment and you have to obey, right? And then the second stage is reasoning from self-interest. So we've looked at ethical egoism and contract theory that were rooted in self-interest, but they only fall in Kohlberg's theory of moral development, which is a theory of moral maturity, basically, right? Moving from the lowest stage of immaturity to the highest stage of maturity. Self-interest only falls in the second stage. And then the third stage is interpersonal accord and conformity. So again, think of moral development when you're in your formative years and you're the kid in school, right, in elementary or middle school, the oddball always gets picked on, right? So what we want to not stand out. We want group conformity, basically, right? And then fourth, authority or deference to authority and maintaining social order. That's the fourth stage. Then the fifth stage is a social contract, keeping our agreements with one another, orientation and morality. And then the sixth stage of development, what's supposed to be indicative of moral maturity, is the recognition of some kind of universal principles to guide behavior, right? And so, again, Kohlberg developed this theory on the basis of his observations of men, young men, right, and the development of men, males, right? And so Gilligan notes this and wonders, well, doesn't this mean that the theory of moral development is only taking into account one sex? And if it's only taking into account of one sex, it's got to be a skewed view of what moral development really is. And so From a Different Voice is the title of her book. And she says in there, the moral judgments of women differ from those of men in the greater extent to which women's moral judgments are tied to feelings of empathy and compassion and are concerned with the resolution of real as opposed to hypothetical dilemmas. We'll just stop right there, right? Think about the sort of thought experiments that I had you do for quizzes in this class. And they were hypothetical experiments about pulling a trolley lever, murderers at the door, blowing tanks up to stop a terrorist, right? Where one person has to get sacrificed, or blowing people up in a cave so that everyone else could escape. They're all hypothetical dilemmas that almost, bear some analogs to the real world, but often not very much at all, right? And so she goes on here. However, as long as the categories by which development is assessed are derived from research on men, divergence from the masculine standard can be seen only as a failure of development. So that looks like it's damaging to women. If our sample that we've developed this theory of moral maturity on is it's based only on how men reason and behave in terms of moral psychology, then women are always going to be disadvantaged in that, right? And so that's the point of her theory. So she started looking at young women and how women develop and their views about morality, and comes up with this idea that women have a different moral voice than males do, than men do. And so there's this whole element of this debate that's, a debate basically over how to do good social science, and whether the social science, whether the studies that they've done to develop these theories, how did they match up to rigorous science, or are there problems with those studies? So that's another dimension of it. And if you look up the literature on ethics of care and moral psychology, you can see people debating those issues. And so continuing on then with a few lines out of In a Different Voice, she says, in a different voice of women lies the truth of an ethic of care, the tie between relationship and responsibility, and the origins of aggression and the failure of connection. She says, my research suggests that men and women speak different languages that they assume are the same, using similar words to encode desperate experiences of self and social relationship. So we basically have here, men are from Mars, women are from Venus view of morality. We may use words like justice or care, but we mean different things or have different reference for those terms, such that we're really not even communicating with one another. We have different moral perspectives, is what she's claiming here. And so picking up on that notion, here's Nell Noddings, who is a philosopher, not just a psychologist, and developed some aspects of the ethics of care, taking as her point of departure, Gilligan's kind of research. So let's take a look at a few lines from a few passages out of her work here. So she says, ethics has concentrated for the most part on moral reasoning. In fact, that's basically what this class has been about, is moral reasoning and different forms of moral reasoning, right? This emphasis gives ethics a contemporary mathematical appearance, but it also moves discussion beyond the sphere of actual human activity and feeling that pervades such activity. So just think of Kant, where we have to clear moral reasoning of everything that's merely empirical, contingent to myself, like my mental states, my psychological states, or in utilitarianism, where I have to be an impartial but disinterested and benevolent spectator, right, and just calculate utility, or run a universalizability test, right? That gives the feel of moral decision-making more like an algorithm than the way in which we experience morality in our everyday lives. This is her point here. So she says, the view to be expressed here is a feminine view. So what does she mean by a feminine view? Right? This does not imply that all women will accept it or that men will reject it. Indeed, there's no reason why men should not embrace it. It is feminine in the deep classical sense, rooted in receptivity, relatedness, and responsiveness. So there we have what we can call the 3 R's of the ethics of care: receptivity, openness, and we'll see that receptivity is an issue in Levinas as well, the next theory that we'll look at. Relatedness, right? So we don't exist as abstract individuals, right, with relationship to one another. We're not just utility pump relating to utility pump, or rational agent, qua-rational agent, like in Kant. We have particular social relationships, family relationships, friend, student, teacher, doctor, patient, all those sorts of concrete ways of negotiating and construing our social relationships. So she says, it does not imply either that logic is to be discarded or that it's alien to women. It represents an alternative to present views, one that begins with the moral attitude or longing for moral goodness and not with moral reasoning. Abstract, calculative moral reasoning, universalizability tests, calculation of utility. It may indeed be the case that such an approach is more typical of women than men, but that's an empirical question I shall not attempt to answer. That's what I was mentioning earlier. The social science here is an interesting issue, whether or not there is a statistical difference in the way that men typically approach moral problems versus the way women do. And so she's dealing not with that social science issue here, she's dealing with the conceptual work here. So that's whereas Gilligan was more focused on the empirical issue, Noddings here is focused on the more conceptual side of the theorizing here. So she says, relation will be taken as ontologically basic. For our purposes, relation may be thought of as a set of ordered pairs generated by some rule that describes affective or subjective experience of its members. This suggests that the ethic to be developed here is one of reciprocity, but our view of reciprocity will be different from the contract theorists. What the cared for gives the caring relation is not a promise to behave as one is caring, nor as a form of consideration. So think about the contract theorists that we looked at with Hobbes, moral contractarian. We're self-interested, rational agents. We only agree to those norms out of our own self, what's in our own self-interest. That's supposed to be what justifies a constraint on my action, is what I agree to, because I see that it's in my rational self-interest not to go do certain things because I don't want others to do them to me, right? So that's one kind of reciprocity or reciprocal relationship. But she says that's not the kind that is to be developed here. So reciprocity here has to do with not being egoistic, rational, and self-interested individual, but the sorts of affective, the sorts of dispositions that go into maintaining social relationships of ordered pairs like student-teacher or parent-child. Right? So our example here at the end is going to be Rick and Morty here. So think about, and we'll come back to this, the way in which Beth criticizes Rick and his way of parenting, right? And of course, Rick abandons his family as when she's younger. This is part of her adult problem, right, that she has relating to her father and why she wants desperately to cling to him and is worried that he's always going to leave again. Right? So we'll come back to that notion of what kinds of attitudes are required for maintaining healthy and not just healthy, nurturing relationships. Right? So speaking of that, the center of this ethics, the primary emphasis is on nurturement, caring, and sympathy, right? Empathy for others, rather than figuring out what to do in terms of abstract principles of justice, like in utilitarianism or deontology. So ethical caring, the relations in which we do meet each other morally, will be the universal heart of this ethic. And we must establish a convincing and comprehensive picture of that caring at the outset. So I mentioned that the ethics of care has some in common with some of the views that we've looked at previously. And the one that it bears, to my thinking, the most in common with is a virtue ethics, because it's worried about what kinds of dispositions we're going to develop. We didn't see a whole lot about empathy and sympathy in Aristotle, but he was focused on virtues, right? And the ethics of care seems focused on that sort of thing, the kinds of dispositions that we develop. And so when she says the deep classical sense rooted in receptivity, relatedness, and responsiveness, it looks like what she's talking about are character traits, right? And so that's a kind of a warm-up, then the basic idea, the basic orientation of an ethics of care, and then elaborating that even further is Annette Beyer. And so she has this essay called What Do Women Want in a Moral Theory? And of course that depends on what you mean by theory, right? And then argues that women have a unique perspective to add to theorizing. And so the central notions in her approach to moral theory that she thinks is indebted to women's experience are ideas of trust and care, right? So we've not seen trust come up very much at all in any of the previous theories that we've looked at. So she says here, one can look and see what sort of contributions women have made to moral philosophy. Such a look confirms, I think, Gilligan's findings. What one finds is a bit of a different tone and approach from the standard sort of moral philosophy done by men, following in the footsteps of the great moral philosophers, all men. I seem to hear a different voice from the standard moral philosopher's voice. I hear the voice that Gilligan heard, made reflective and philosophical. What women want in a moral philosophy is what they are providing, and what they are providing seems to me to confirm Gilligan's theses about women. One has to be careful here, of course, for not all important contributions to moral philosophy by women fall easily into Gilligan's stereotype, nor its philosophical extension. And although I don't think I quoted this passage out of this essay, Beyer refers to David Hume, who we haven't really looked at much this semester, but I did talk about him in regard to the is-ought problem. And he kind of has a virtue ethics as well. And central to he's kind of an outlier in this regard. Central to his approach to moral thinking was the idea of sympathy, right? And the moral sentiments. And so Although she talks about how most moral theories were developed by men and were abstract, emphasizing abstract principles of justice, Hume is someone that she thinks care ethicists ought to look to as a basis for starting to work some of this theory out for ethics of care. And so here's the basic idea then, that justice versus care debate. It's a debate in moral philosophy over whether there are two distinct, conceptually distinct, moral perspectives, or are these two perspectives not really distinct? Are they mutually exclusive, or are they can they be combined? Are they not really forming a dichotomy, but are they complementary to one another? And the next author we'll look at argues for that position. Although we have to be careful with Beyer here as well, because she doesn't hold a real hard view of that distinction. So she says, what would be a suitable central question, principle, or concept to structure a moral theory which might accommodate those moral insights women tend to have more readily than men? And to answer those moral questions, which it seems worry women more than men, I hypothesize that a women's moral theory, expressive mainly of women's insights and concerns, would be an ethics of love. Well, what is love? Love is about regarding the other, right? It's about putting the other person's need above your own, right? Empathy and sympathy. Either adopting the perspective of the other, or being able to actually feel their feelings, right? So where did I drop off here? I say, but presumably, so I'm picking up down at the bottom of this quote, but presumably women theorists will be like enough to men to want their moral theory to be acceptable to all. So acceptable both to reflective women and reflective men. So women theorists will need to connect their ethics of love with what has been the men theorists' preoccupation, namely obligation. So earlier I mentioned that Beyer doesn't have a real hard view of this distinction between ethics and care and the ethics of justice. She wants them to go together to form a more comprehensive moral theory is what she's really after here. So she says, in concentrating on obligations rather than virtues, and I've already mentioned that I think that for this very reason, that the ethics of care is more like a virtue ethics than either deontology or moral theory. So in concentrating on obligations rather than virtues, moral theorists have chosen to look at the cases where more trust is placed in enforcers of obligations than is placed in ordinary moral agents, the bearers of these obligations. In taking, as contractarians do, contractual obligations as the model of obligations, I'm obligated to do what I agreed to, right? They concentrate on a case where the very minimal trust is put in the obligated person, and considerable punitive power entrusted to the one whom the obligation is owed. I assume here that Hume is right in saying that when we promise or contract, we formally subject ourselves to penalty in the case of failure, of never being trusted by a promiser again. So again, think of that prisoner's dilemma, where you're trying to agree what to do with someone that you can't even you can't even coordinate with, you can't communicate with, right? So this is an interesting case of the allocation of trust of all sorts, but it surely distorts our moral vision to suppose that all obligations, let alone morally pressured expectations we impose on others, conform to an abnormally coercive model. I mean, again, just think of what the contract theorists that we looked at tried to develop out of the prisoner's dilemma. They tried to develop an entire theory out of morality based on what we could expect others to rationally do, right? But the problem all of us had with the prisoner's dilemma is that we don't know whether to trust this other person or not, right? So again, think of Rick and Morty here with regard to Beth. And in particular, I have in mind the episode, The ABCs of Beth, which is in season 3. And it's where Beth confronts Rick, her father, about how she doesn't think he was a good parent. He didn't care and nurture her. That's basically her objection. So right now is a good spot in the lecture to just pause and take a look at that episode of Rick and Morty. There's a link to it on Moodle for you, to a free version. So after you have a look at that episode and try to think about that episode through the lens of care ethics, then come back and pick up the last part of this lecture. So I'll pause here for a second and then pick back up with the next thing. All right, so hopefully you've gone and looked at that episode of Rick and Morty, and you can see what Beth's complaint. Her complaint is that Rick didn't express or nurture her in a way that is conducive to maintaining or promoting the well-being of a child, right? In other words, she's complaining that he didn't really care for her, right? He didn't nurture her. He didn't demonstrate any nurturing traits to her or inculcate those in her as a child, right? And so this is the basis of their tenuous and stressful and strained adult relationship, right? Beth is always worried that she's going to do something that causes Rick to leave again, right? So that the problem in the family is that, from the perspective of care ethics, is that, they're not always nurturing one another, right, in the ways that we would hope that families would do so. And so now let's turn to Friedman here. She's got this essay called Beyond Caring, right, the demoralization of gender. And she's going to take issue with the idea that there is a justice-care dichotomy. She's going to argue that justice is relevant to interpersonal relationships, and that therefore the idea that there are two distinct moral perspectives, and more so that one of them is indicative of men and one of them is indicative of women, the care versus the justice, that they're really mingled to one another, and that the way in which we interpret each other's actions based on our sex, right, and based on our gender, is misleading. So let's see what she has to say here about that notion. So several key things that she notes. First of all, she mentions that Gilligan really has two theses. The first is the different voice thesis. So that's the idea that women have their own unique moral perspective, which was Gilligan's view. Right? And then the gender difference hypothesis is the idea that care is indicative of feminine and female moral experience and reasoning or perspective, and that justice is indicative of masculine and male moral experience and perspective. Right? And then she notes that there appear to be some empirical problems with dividing it that way, with the gender difference thesis. Right? And then, so she's going to talk about this idea of a moralized interpretation of gender roles. So you can think there about our list that we came up with at the beginning of the lecture. And then she's going to offer a criticism of that justice versus care dichotomy. So again, two different hypotheses here. And she challenges both of them. Although as a philosopher, she's worried less about trying to show the empirical evidence doesn't really bear out that men do it one way and women do it another way. She's really more worried about the different voice hypothesis. So she says, remember the title of the article, Demoralization of Gender. So she says, to say that the genders are moralized is to say that specific moral ideals, values, virtues, and practices are culturally conceived as the special projects or domains of specific genders. So again, think of the little list that I had to start thinking about at the very beginning, where stereotypically men have these sorts of traits and women have these other sorts of traits. Men are, assertive, dominant, so forth. But women, if they're assertive and dominant, they get called different names, right? They're not appreciated as being strong leaders. They're called something else, right? So that's what she means by the moralization of gender roles, right? So she says these conceptions would determine which commitments and behaviors were to be considered normal, appropriate, and expected of each gender, which commitments and behaviors were to be considered remarkable or heroic, and which commitments and behaviors were to be considered deviant, improper, outrageous, or intolerable. So just think about the way, in our everyday lives, people make comments about how, oh, that guy acts this way in like a non-masculine way, or how some particular woman might act like a man, right? That's what she's driving at here in terms of what we expect based on gender, right? So in Simone de Beauvoir, we had this idea that, look, there's sexual difference, but that should not be the basis of any kind of discrimination, right? Social discrimination in particular, or political discrimination. People should be able to shape their lives as they want to, right? Here, we have this idea of a gender difference, that what's normal and appropriate and how women ought to behave is different than how men ought to behave. Right? So, and again, Friedman's challenging this notion. So she says both men and women on average still conceive women and men in a moralized fashion. For example, expectations and perceptions of women's greater empathy and altruism are expressed by both men and women. Again, think of the idea of a nurse, and probably when I say nurse, you immediately think of a woman, right? And probably when we even say teacher, your first thought is maybe just thinking of a woman, right? At least there's a good chance that those are the cases, right? So the gender stereotypes of women center around qualities that which some authors call communal. These include, as opposed to autonomous and individual. Right? So these include a concern for the welfare of others. There's the care, the other-oriented, the more altruistic orientation, the predominance of caring and nurturing traits, and to a lesser extent, interpersonal sensitivity, emotional expressiveness, and a gentle personal style. So she says, the moralization of gender is more a matter of how we think we reason than of how we actually reason. So earlier in the essay, I didn't quote this part, but she points out that there's some issues with the social science that says, that challenging the idea that women really have this way of doing it and men have this way of doing it. Right? So on the basis of that problem, she's noting, look, this is really more a matter of our perception of how we think things work rather than how it works. So the moralization of gender is more a matter of how we think we reason than of how we actually reason, more a matter of moral concerns we attribute to women and men than of true statistical differences between women's and men's moral reasoning. So again, there's her point about social science. So earlier in the semester, I mentioned the situation of subjection to virtue ethics, where we make the fundamental attribution error. We attribute the person's behavior to a stable character trait rather than thinking about the social circumstances that really led them to behave in that way. It's a similar thing going on here with regard to gender and morality. So Gilligan's findings resonate with the experience of many people because those experiences are shaped in part by cultural myths and stereotypes of gender, which even feminist theorizing may not dispel. Thus, both women and men in our culture expect women and men to exhibit this moral dichotomy, justice versus care. And on my hypothesis, it is this expectation which has shaped both Gilligan's observations and the plausibility which we attribute to them. Or to put it somewhat differently, whatever moral matters men concern themselves with are categorized esteemably as matters of justice or rights, whereas the moral concerns of women are assigned the devalued categories of care and personal relationships. So again, we get a form of women do it this way, men do it this way. And one of them is esteemed and one of them is devalued. So she says, if that's all really not the case, and it's the way we just perceive things rather than the way things really are, the way we interpret behaviors due to cultural influence or something like that, as opposed to the way they really are. Well, why are they so vivid? Why are these stereotypes so prominent in our thinking? So she asks that issue. She raises that issue. It's important to ask why, if these beliefs are so vividly held, they might nevertheless still not have produced a reality in conformity with them. How could those critics who challenge Gilligan's gender hypothesis be right to suggest that women and men show no significant differences in moral reasoning if women and men are culturally educated, trained, pressured, expected, and perceived to be radically different? Here's her answer to that question. My admittedly partial answer to it depends on showing that, not chat, should be that there, that the care-justice dichotomy is rationally implausible and that the two concepts are conceptually compatible. So here's her rejection of any kind of hard either or, care versus justice. The conceptual compatibility creates the empirical possibility that the two moral concerns be intermingled in practice, but when we see a woman do something, we pick out the care stuff. When we see a man do something, we pick out the justice stuff. And then attribute one to one, but not the other, even though they're intermingled. So how is it that justice is relevant to interpersonal relationships, right? So to close concrete interrelationships like student, teacher, parent, child, siblings, friends, all those sorts of things that didn't seem to get included in our more mainstream modern moral theories where social relationships were construed very abstractly. So justice is relevant to close personal relationships among comparable moral persons in a second way as well. The trust and intimacy which characterize special relationships, create special vulnerabilities to harm. Commonly recognized harms such as physical injury and sexual assault become more feasible, and special relationships in corrupt, abusive, and degenerate forms make possible certain uncommon emotional harms not even possible in impersonal relationships. When someone is harmed in a personal relationship, she is owed a rectification of some sort, a righting of the wrong which has been done her. The notion of justice emerges once again as a relevant moral notion. So in other words, I mean, think of it this way. If I promise my wife that I'm going to go to lunch with her, so it's a close, right? I'm talking about a close personal relationship with her, not citizen to citizen or in the political arena, but my wife, right? So spousal relationship. If I promise her that we're going to go out to lunch, but then I have to break that promise, what do I try to do? Well, I try to make that right, that I had to break that promise. Suppose I get held up at work and now I can't go to lunch with my wife. Well, what am I going to do? I'm going to try to make it up to her in some way, right? Even though that's fairly innocuous, a fairly unproblematic issue, right? I wasn't able to meet my promise, right? And we do this in ordinary lives. We try to make up for when we have to break a promise or when something bad happens, right? And so that's what she's talking about here. It's not as if I'm not worried or that about just treating my wife justly. It's just that justice involves an interpersonal relationship between her and I. So she says, in light of these reflections, it seems both wise to reconsider the seeming dichotomy of care and justice and to question the moral adequacy of either orientation disassociated from the other. Our aim would be to advance beyond caring. Remember, the title of the essay is Beyond Caring, the Demoralization of Genders. So our aim would be to advance beyond caring. That is beyond mere caring, disassociated from a concern for justice. In addition, we would do well to progress beyond gender stereotypes, which assign distinct and different moral roles to men and women. Our ultimate goal should be a non-gendered, non-dichotomized moral framework in which all moral concerns could be expressed. We might, with intentional irony, call this the demoralization of genders. That kind of looks like Simone de Beauvoir's idea of reciprocal freedom, right? It's just that they're, in the existentialist school of thought, the idea of freedom figured centrally. We've heard them here talk about trust and care more than freedom or autonomy. Right. So, but it's a very similar notion. We're moving past the gendered roles understood from a patriarchal system into the recognition of equal moral worth, where everyone's moral perspective needs to be heard. Right. So that would be some kind of non-oppressive relationship where gender is not used to devalue one versus esteeming the other. And so in this debate, we got some basic options. So first, the first option. So in other words, you can think about how the last three thinkers that we just looked at, how they might fit into these basic options on the debate between sex, gender, and ethics. So the first option is a male-only option, that the best moral theories are by male, it's a male perspective, and everybody ought to adopt that male perspective. The other one is the female only, so that's like the inversion of that. So it's the care perspective, and everyone ought to comport to the care perspective, right? Then we have the separate but equal perspective. So care versus justice, right, where there's a versus and either are, and both are important. And then the fourth option is the mutually inclusive perspective. That's somebody like Friedman, who thinks that both justice and care go together, right? So you get some basic options in that debate. And then our question would be, which of those four theoretical options is supported by both the empirical evidence regarding moral psychology and by the best philosophical theorizing, by the best arguments, right? And so there are the options laid out for you for a care ethics. Again, this is just an approach that emphasizes the idea that nurturement and cultivating cultivating empathy and sympathy for others is the key to nurturing social and maintaining social relationships. So being open to others, responsive to the needs of others, and having reciprocal relationships with them. So that's the ethics of care. Be sure and check out the episode of Rick and Morty that goes along with this. And you might also take a look at the supplemental video on care ethics that I posted as well. As always, be sure and send me your questions by email or post them in the discussion forum. It's not a lot of activity going on there, so I'm a little bit worried. Don't want y'all to put it off to the last minute and miss out on an opportunity for getting any questions answered before you have to worry about the quiz, and then lastly, the exam on this chapter. So be sure and send me those questions. Again, I'm available during my regular office hours. You can arrange a meeting online. You can also ask questions during the live class session coming up at the end of this chapter. All right, folks, so I hope y'all are all doing well and caring for one another. All right, y'all have a good one.